Good evening and welcome. Today we are going to begin a series on the brain's anatomy. At the completion of this tutorial, you would have understood the divisions of the human brain. These include the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. However, for the consideration of today's tutorial, we are going to focus on the first two that include the divisions of the human brain and the first division, which is the forebrain. Let's begin with the divisions of the brain. As stated, there are three divisions of the brain. So there are three divisions of the brain, and we highlighted them earlier. They are the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. But let's know where these segments or portions of the brain are located. We use our friend here. The segment of the brain that is encircled here is primarily made of the cerebrum, and this portion of the brain is referred to as the forebrain. Just beneath the forebrain is another segment here, and this we refer to it as the midbrain. And more inferior is the hindbrain. These are the three divisions of the brain. And as stated, the focus of this tutorial is the forebrain. In subsequent tutorials, we are going to look at the hand or the midbrain and the hindbrain. Let's get started. The forebrain. The forebrain is divided into two segments or parts. Let's write that down. The forebrain is divided into two segments, or it has two segments or parts. And we're going to use our same old friend to demonstrate those segments of the forebrain. Recap of our forebrain structure. This is the segment we are looking at here. And the center of this forebrain is referred to as the Diocephalum. And the remaining portion of the forebrain that surrounds the Diocephalum is called the Telesephora. So these are the two major divisions of the forebrain. We will now zoom in to further understand the structures that make up the forebrain, that is the telecephalum and the diencephalum. We will begin our discussion of the forebrain structures with the telecephalum. To enable us better appreciate the various structures of the telecephalum, we are going to use a coronal section of the brain as we can see here. The brain here, we see that there are two types of tissues or sections we are looking at here. We see the gray matter in the peripheral and also in the middle. Then we see white patches scattered in the middle of the brain. The gray matter that is found around the brain or in the periphery of the brain is referred to as the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex, if you look at the brain from the exterior, you see that it is divided into different lobes. The lobes of the cerebral cortex are the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the insular lobe. From the section we have here, we cannot appreciate all of these lobes. However, in subsequent tutorial, we are going to look at each of these lobes in depth. We now turn our attention to the gray matters that are found in the center of the brain. These are also important structures. So the gray matters that are found in the center of the brain I call the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei are divided into different groups, not primarily for functional reasons, but for better description. These are the corpus striatum, the amygdaloid nucleus, and the claustrum. These are the three groups of basal nuclei. These basal nuclei, they usually help the body respond to environmental changes. So let's take, for example, a person is exposed to a factor that causes fear. The basal nuclei will cause the heart rate of that person to increase. It will also cause the breathing rate of the person to increase. So those are important functions of these basal nuclei. Just a side note, you might hear someone referring to the basal nuclei as the basal ganglia. These are the same thing, just that the basal nuclei is more accepted when it comes to the brain as compared to the basal ganglia. Reason being, the basal of both names refer to the same structure, basal nuclei, basal ganglia. They all refer to the collection of the neural cell body. But the location of that neural cell body is what determines the name. If the neural cell body collection is located in the peripheral nervous system, we refer to as the ganglia. That is why you often hear the sympathetic ganglia, the ciliary ganglia, and so forth. However, if the collection of the neural cell body is located in the spinal cord or the brain, we refer to it as nuclear. That is why we prefer using basal nuclear for these structures that are here as compared to using basal ganglia. Let's move on. That was just a side bonus. We will continue our discussion of the structures of the telecephalum. But now we will look at another view, and this is more of the lateral view of the brain to better enable us identify other structures. Let's start. Most superior here we have the cingulate gyrus, which is a major component of the limbic system, and back here we have the hippocampus, which is also very important. And more anterior here, we have the olfactory bulb. Remember, the olfactory nerves that are located at the top of the nose receive signal and they converge above the cribriform plate to form olfactory bulbs right at the base of the frontal lobe. So this is one of the important structures that is located in the telecephalum. Also, though it is located in the basal nuclei, but I would also love to highlight the amygdala nucleus that can be seen in this section of the brain. These are the major division or the major component of the telencephalon. So let's get a summary of our first section of the forebrain discussion, which is the telecephalon. This is another view, and in this view, we can also identify the hippocampus and the amygdala. So I just thought to enable us better understand the structure of these various components of the telecephalon. We have the amygdala here also. So to summarize the structures that make up the telecephalon, we just list them here. The first is we have the cerebral cortex, you remember? Next, we have the basal nuclei that are located in the core of the brain. Also, we have the cingulate gyrus, or gyrus that was highlighted, and we have the hippocampus also being discussed. These are major structures in addition to the olfactory bulbs that form the telecephalon. We will now turn our attention to the next division of the forebrain, which is the Diocephalum. Let's go back. Alright, you remember the photo here, right? So we are through with this component of the brain. We are through with discussing the subcomponents of the telecephalum. So what is the Diocephalum made of? This is now our next point of focus. Let's move on. Next, we will look at the Diocephalum that is highlighted here. This is the smallest division of the entire forebrain. The telecephalon, as you can see, is very large. So to begin our discussion of the diencephalon, we are going to look at the boundaries of the diencephalon, that is structures that are located along the periphery of the diencephalon. We will continue our naming in a clockwise direction. So firstly, inferior here is the optic chiasma. So we have the optic chiasma located down here. Next, we have the lamina terminalis, which is the section that is highlighted here. And above the lamina terminalis is the anterior commissure, which is located here. Just above here, though it is a bit difficult to see around here, but this is the interventricular foramen. Do you remember this? We discussed the interventricular foramen when we're talking about the various ventricles between the lateral ventricles of the brain and the medial ventricles or the middle ventricles of the brain. That is the third ventricle, sorry, of the brain. Extending posterior here, we have the tela. This structure primarily is full of the inner or the most closest lining of the brain known as the pia mater. So the pia mater folds and it leads to the formation of the tela. The tela also extends and forms the tela plexus, which we'll discuss in another video. Below here is the habenular commissure. The habenular commissure is also the posterior margin of the brain, and just beneath the habenular commissure we have the pineal body that is located here, and inferior to the pineal body we have the posterior commissure, and most inferiorly we have the mammillary body. So these are the structures that form the boundary of the diencephalon that we are observing here. Next, we'll pay attention to the structures that are located within the diencephalon. What are the structures? Let's move on. Next, we will continue our discussion looking at the contents of the Diocephalum. If you can recall, the Diocephalum has the third ventricle located in the middle. And as per our last discussion, we stated that the third ventricle has the thalamus located on the lateral side forming the lateral wall. So, discussing the structures of the Diocephalum, what we are looking at here is the thalamus. More inferiorly, the structure below the thalamus or the area below the thalamus here is called the hypothalamus. The thalamus and hypothalamus, they are divided by these circles. So what is this circles here called? This is called the hypothalamic circles. Moving more posteriorly, we will look at the structure of the Diocephalum that's located here. This structure is, or this area of the Diocephalum is referred to as the subthalamus. And posteriorly, the Diocephalum is bordered by structures as we listed. However, these structures are also considered as part of the Diocephalum. The first one we talked about here was the pineal body. And most superior to the pineal body, we talk about the habenular commissure. These two structures here are referred to as the epithalamus. So, to conclude, the Diocephalum is made of primarily four basic structures: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the subthalamus, and the epithalamus. And let me just point out something here. If we observe during our study of the various structures, we've used half of the brain, meaning we use the right cerebral hemisphere. That is, the dicephalon is divided by the third ventricle into two symmetrical parts. So all of the structures that we are looking at here on the medial surface of this right cerebral hemisphere are also found on the medial surface of the left cerebral hemisphere. I just thought to point out that. To conclude our tutorial for today, let's get a summary of what all we've discussed. Remember, we talked about the division of the brain. There are three: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The forebrain, as we stated, is divided into the telecephalum and the diencephalum. The telecephalum is further made of the cerebral cortex, the basal nucleus, the cingulate gyrus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the olfactory bulb. As I stated, the amygdala can also be considered as part of the basal nucleus. Next, the diencephalum, as stated, it has four major parts. We have the epithalamus, we have the thalamus, the subthalamus, and the hypothalamus. Each of these substructures listed here are very important, and in our next tutorial we will try to look at each of these structures, discuss the cerebral cortex, the basal nucleus, and so forth. So thank you again for watching today. We highly appreciate your comments and suggestions from our first video, and it has been our aim to make improvements as is suggested. So we encourage you to keep on supporting this channel and help us achieve the goal of providing knowledge to both biology students and medical students. Thank you very much. If it's not yet subscribed, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel or better hit the like button. Thank you very much.